Hello, kindred resistors against the dysgenesis of modernity. This is Govan here with GovanKilgour.com. As I mentioned in my return video, just the previous one I uploaded a little bit ago, I wanted to do these videos on sort of macro astrological cycles. And this is the most important one in that it's the most macro cycle. It's the biggest overarching one, which colors all the other ones that are going on right now, that we're coming up to some of them or have just encountered them. And it's also one that we've just started relatively recently, although it was a few years ago. This is a 2,150 year cycle that supposedly began or reset or started over in 2012. So technically the cycle itself is over 25,000 years, closer to 26,000 years long. And I'll put up an image on the screen here. And what this is the entire zodiac wheel in reverse zodiacal order. We actually travel through it backwards compared to when we're thinking of the zodiac sign through the year. Year to year, we go from, if you start at Aries, that's the first sign. The start is on the spring equinox, and you go around and you end in Pisces. Whereas in what's called the greater year or the great year, it's this reversal through the signs because of what's called the precession of the equinox, which is, in scientific terms, it's the wobble in Earth's axis as it spins. So this causes a very slow rotation, and that's why also the North Star over time becomes a different star. So back in Egyptian times, the North Star was Thuban, which is in the constellation Draco, whereas right now it's Polaris, the North Star, what we consider to be the North Star. So if that's moving, you get these slight variations in how the sky moves above us. And I won't get too much in the technical side of it because I'll probably say something that's not right. But basically, we can correspond that to this reverse movement through the zodiac signs. And we just ended the Age of Pisces, entered the Age of Aquarius. That's why you have all the pop culture reference to the Age of Aquarius, from the song to it's mentioned in movies and things. Often has this very new age vibe and reference, and that can be good and bad, because when you start talking to people about it, they just kind of laugh about it. Everyone starts singing the song. But it's not as happy-go-lucky as people think. I mean, it is in the sense that, technically speaking, the Age of Pisces was the darkest age. So of these 12 different ages, the Age of Pisces is when we're the furthest away from the galactic center, or whatever it is we're rotating around, because with the wobble also comes our position relative, like our whole solar system's position relative to other things going on in the galaxy. And so as we get closer to the golden age, it's like 12,000 years away, I guess. We supposedly interact with Sirius in that there's like this sort of figure eight that happens, and then we come back and do this sort of big figure eight with Sirius. To get back to the ages themselves, each age has the influence of that sign, and so each sign is ruled by planets, and so the qualities of the planets influence the time that they're in. So for example, in the Age of Taurus, a lot of the religions around the world involved bulls and cows. So you had Hathor in Egypt was worshipped. That's a female fertility goddess. And then you also had the Apis bull. You had Moloch, I think, in Carthage. Then in the Age of Aries, you had both lambs and rams and sheep that were being referenced. And actually, I think the myth or the story of Moses, when he was coming down, he saw his people worshipping a golden calf, and he was telling them to stop doing that. That was basically talking about the end of the Age of Taurus, going into the Age of Aries, and him saying, we got to stop this ancient practice and move into the practice of the time. And so that's when you would see like a lot more, especially when it comes to animal sacrifice, they were sacrificing sheep and lambs and things like that. And then, of course, you had the Age of Pisces, which is, you had the Christianity that rose to prominence, as well eventually Islam, and so these Abrahamic religions. So even though Abraham would have lived during the Age of Aries, the influence and growth of that belief system came to prominence in the Age of Pisces. And if you look at Pisces itself, it's ruled by two planets, because it's actually, since we have the modern discovery of Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, those have replaced some of the traditional rulers of three signs. But we actually do say they have a dual rulership. So Pisces is ruled by both Jupiter, which was its traditional ruler in traditional astrology, and the qualities associated with Jupiter, and then you also have Neptune. So Jupiter has to do with expansion. It's a very positive planet, and it's associated with abundance. Jupiter, Jove, Zeus, these are all synonymous deities. Also Thor. That's where you get Thor's Day, or Jeudi is the French, Jeudi, or Jupiter's Day. So it has a lot of positive associations, but every planet has its positives and negatives. So even though you might have something that is more of a benefic in terms of the effect the planet has on you, it can have a detriment in that it can push you into excess. So, for example, Christianity, as represented as a Jupiterian religion, you could also say it's also solar. It's a combination of both solar and Jupiter influence in the religion itself. That excess Jupiter expansion can probably be connected to the fact that there's a lot of obesity within Christianity, at least in this time when you could say it's the twilight of Christianity's influence, or at least the Jupiterian version of Christianity's influence. Perhaps Christianity is undergoing a change in its value system, and thus the planet that influences it. But yeah, the Age of Pisces being associated with Jupiter, it brought that abundance. That's when we saw the most prosperity be created in the world, you could say, just because of the advancements of technology. And then the Neptune influence is obviously that creativity, that belief system. But then the negative side of Neptune is illusion and also fanaticism. So you obviously see fanaticism and can make that connection with its influence over the years. And since entering the Age of Aquarius, and I'll give the reasons why I think it's definite that we did enter it in 2012, early 2013 there, we are now under the influence of both Saturn and Uranus. That is the rulership of Aquarius. The only other sign with a dual rulership like that is Scorpio. So it's traditionally ruled by Mars, but then you have the Pluto rulership of Scorpio as well. So in Aquarius, the traditional ruler of Saturn is obviously traditional. It's probably the most malefic planet in that it's the harshest, it's the coldest, heaviest planet energetically. But you have this ability for it to also break down the things that are no longer serving you, and you have to sort of recreate your life in a way that is suited to being in alignment with yourself. So that's what we call it. When Saturn return is when Saturn reaches that point in your chart where it was at back when you were born. So that's about 29 and a half years, which is the amount of time it takes for Saturn to do one full rotation of the sun. So that means it's like back in line with that point in your chart. And a lot of people go through upheaval at the time. But if your life is pretty in alignment with your core inner goals and ideals, you might not have as rough a time of it. I certainly had an interesting time. It had its rough points, but it wasn't as bad as what I've heard other people go through. So when you do get aligned with yourself and your personal goals and self-betterment, you're not going down these sort of like tangential life paths. It's not as rough to experience the influence of Saturn. But when we're talking about the sign of Aquarius, it is a Saturnian influence over the whole world. So it is very disruptive, even though we can say that Pisces was so dark because we had so much war and death in such greater proportions than what I think we'll ever experience again. But that doesn't mean we're out of the thick of it. As you see in that image there, it does say this is like the Bronze Age coming out of the Dark Age. And it's not literally the Bronze Age of technologically speaking. It's more Bronze Age in comparison to the Golden Age. We're just getting a little bit of an improvement. We do still have that oppressive aspect of Saturn, which is represented in the crackdown of the state on people now. So in the past you had the Jupiterian influence, which brought a lot of abundance, even though we could say like there's a lot of systems in government from the past which people didn't like. When it was good, the times were good, which you saw a lot of, especially at the end there. In the 80s and 90s, it was a time to really create a lot of abundance for yourself. But I think we're going to be seeing a lot more austerity, but we're also seeing the overthrow of old systems that aren't for humanity's greatest good. Because Aquarius is the humanitarian. It is the sign, if you are an Aquarius sun or an Aquarius rising sign perhaps, or your moon's in Aquarius, one of these important planets or angles in your chart, if they're in Aquarius, you do have a strong aspect of yourself that is drawn to humanitarian causes and uplifting people around you. So pretty nice sign in that sense, but it's not to say other signs can't be generous like that as well, but there's a drive to improve the world at large in Aquarius. And I think that comes a lot more from the Uranus influence, and this is why it made sense when Uranus was discovered that it got placed in Aquarius. It's a very rebellious planet, like I had mentioned in the previous video. It was discovered in between 1776 of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. I forget the exact year it was discovered, but it got associated with revolution partly there, but also they just saw the influence it had over time as they tracked its movements and its speed. It's a very slow-moving planet. It takes 84 years to do a full orbit of the sun. And for instance, just as a interesting tidbit to take into account, if you consider the last time Uranus was at the point it was at right before it moved into Taurus, so it was in Aries, on the edge of moving from Aries to Taurus, the last time it was at that point. So by the way, just as an aside, right now it's in Taurus. It's about 5 degrees and a bit into Taurus. Back in 2017, it was at the same point it was at 84 years ago, which was 1933. Now that's not to say it's identical, that what was happening in 1933 is identical to what's happened in 2017, if we're talking about political elections. But you can understand that there's a similar vibe, that rebellious vibe of defying the controlling establishment. So I won't get more into it than that, but you can make of that what you will. So a lot of people have this image of Uranus as being very liberal. And it's liberating because Uranus wants freedom, and it creates the desire for people to have freedom. But you're only going to have freedom from whatever's the ruling system in place. So if the ruling system is liberalism, then you might actually find traditionalism to be more liberating, more freedom-inducing. So in some sense, Uranus has some similarities to Saturn in that it could actually be pushing humanity towards some Saturnalian type qualities, such as tradition. I think people are fed up with progressivism in the sense of it being social progressivism. I think people do want a certain degree of economic progressivism to counteract the corporatism, and corporatism is a Saturnian influence. So, like, I'm just kind of riffing off some of these ideas. There's pros and cons to each planet, and we see different aspects going on right now. And those have increased since 2012, especially in the rebellion department. You see all sorts of movements of people from astroturfed, Black Lives Matter, or what have you. What's the other ones? The more natural, true grassroots movements, such as the Yellow Vests more recently. Whether it's government-induced or genuine people's upheaval, we're going to see more of that and see that happening. Obviously, not right now with what's going on. But even that, you could say that this epidemic is a out-of-the-blue type event. But again, we'll do the astrology of that in a different episode. The thing that I think seriously indicates symbolically that we've entered this new age is, if you look at the symbolism of Uranus, you have these two waves. And a lot of people associate that with water waves, because with the constellation of Aquarius, you have that image of a man pouring a jug of water. But Aquarius is an air sign. So even though you have waves, that could be like the water coming out of the vase that he's pouring, I think it actually makes more sense as lightning bolts. Uranus governs inventions, electricity, you could even say lightning. And just at the end of 2012, right, actually in 2013, it was the end of February of 2013, you had the event of the Pope stepping down. So the previous Pope, Pope Benedict, I think the 14th, the Ratzinger, the one that people thought was pretty harsh for some reason, he stepped down, and then we got the current Pope. The name escapes me. The one a lot of people are just kind of like disturbed by or disgusted by, because he's so flagrantly non-Catholic seeming. I'm not Catholic, but even just seeing what he does, it's like, how can they stand this guy? He's like going against everything that they stand for. But you could say that is because we're in a new age. And right at that, shortly after, the same day that he stepped down, the Vatican was struck by lightning. Not once, but twice. The likelihood, I think it's rarely struck by lightning anyways, just because there's larger buildings around and there's probably lightning rods that are set up to divert lightning away from the Vatican. But for it to be struck by lightning just hours after he stepped down is in and of itself an auspicious sign, but for it to be struck twice during a storm, I think that's pretty important to look at. So again, 2 lightning bolts strike the Vatican. The Vatican symbolizes, the biggest accomplishment of Christianity, in a sense of it being like the largest institution of all the different Christian institutions. Maybe not the richest anymore, but definitely the most prominent with the longest timeline. And if you could call it an act of God, that's that dividing line between the Age of Pisces. This is the end of the era of Christianity. Not to say Christianity is about to go anywhere. It's just taking a different form, I think. There's obviously, it's waning in its prominence to a certain degree. I think that's true. But it might not be waning as fast as people might think it will. I think there's people also returning to it due to the influence of Aquarius. So it was definitely on the decline, the end of Age of Pisces, with atheism and stuff. Yeah, I'm not trying to predict the future of Christianity itself, but I think that's an interesting point to just look at, is that changeover from Pisces to Aquarius. Recognize what Aquarius is about, what these planets symbolize, what influence they're going to have. And then these other macro cycles I'll be talking about obviously have that overarching influence of Aquarius on them. And really what happens in any given age is you have that representation of the planets within the spirituality of the times. What we're going to see in the Age of Aquarius, I don't know if there's going to be a new religion, or a lot of people kind of theorize that the new religion is Satanism, because Saturn has that etymological connection to Satan, at least satyrs, which are connected to the origin of the word Saturn. And then satyrs are a symbol that is often used to depict the devil in modern times. There is a connection, both in terms of the qualities that Saturn embodies, and you could say they're satanic in that sense, because they're kind of a reverse of Jupiter's qualities, which are much more holy, because it represents spirituality governing over the material world, whereas Saturn's the reverse. It's the material world governing over spirituality. I don't think Satanism makes sense, just because it's quite a mishmash of different things. It doesn't quite line up perfectly with Saturn, because you obviously, if we're talking about like the hedonistic Satanism, like the atheistic Satanism, they have a lot of emphasis on things that are not traditional. They break things for the sake of breaking things, like going against the grain, which you can even call as maybe being Uranian, but again, I think that's a much more altered philosophy. I don't think it has the capacity or the ability to be a sustainable religion long term for the planet in any great mass movement. If you look at Saturn's influence on certain older sects, you obviously have like Orthodox Judaism. They have all sorts of Saturn symbology within there, both in the way they dress, but also like they have the Teflon, which is that little black cube they put on their forehead. The black cube is a Saturn symbol. You could even say like a black headband is a Saturn symbol. Like anything color black that is ringed on your head could be like that. They also, so the black cube Teflon thing with, they also have another one I think on their bicep, yeah. And it's on their left bicep, and they have these like leather straps that they wrap around and hold when they're doing like morning prayers. Those are Saturn symbols, and like the left arm is your non-dominant arm is considered Saturnian. So there's that, but you could also say like Pennsylvanian Dutch, so like what do you call them, the Amish or the Mennonites and these other sects that eschewed technology and stayed very traditional. They dress all in black. They do have a similar hat that looks quite a lot like the Orthodox Judaic hat. So a lot of people don't even think of that. They kind of malign and talk down about Saturn just because it has this association with people that might not have the best interests of Westerners at heart. But then you also see its influence other places. So there's really no good or bad planets. There's people that align themselves with planets, and then they get advantages or disadvantages due to their alignment with that planet. So Saturn's benefited people because they can become very hardworking people with they become austere. They don't spend a lot of money. They procreate because they're traditional, and they have a lot of kids. But also at the same time, Saturn's constricting, so actually their overall population might not be that big. And actually, an interesting thing is if you look at both the Amish and Mennonite communities, as well as very Orthodox Judaism and any other communities, I think, where you see this, especially also Islam, you could say Wahhabism is the sect of Islam that is the most Saturn influence. They often dress in black. The women are covered up kind of in similar ways to the amount that the women are covered in those other mentioned groups. All these groups also have issues with inbreeding a little bit to varying degrees. But yeah, they have an issue there because their populations aren't necessarily as big, yet they do want to have a lot of kids in their individual families, but they just have an issue there with having a big enough population to sustain themselves and avoid the problems of genetics in that regard. I'm kind of just riffing at this point, but that is just my thoughts on some of the influence of Aquarius at this time. And if you had never thought about that, it's an interesting thing to think about. It also, just that chart that I showed of the great year, I think with a lot of what's going on, people are concerned. They have this idea of end times. I think we passed through the end times, honestly. You might even say that the end times were that point where we transitioned, or those final years. We had Obama in the U.S. We had all sorts of stuff going on in the world I don't think that a lot of people liked, and we obviously had a really destructive 20th century in terms of war and actual deaths. And even though there's some heavy things on the future that we have to deal with and face from government, whether it's like surveillance state, technology that might not be for our best health, these are just the modern things that we have to deal with. And even though, again, they're hard and threatening and demoralizing, they don't compare to like all-out war. I would much rather fight the implementation of 5G than have to go through another world war. Again, we might have another world war, but it would look different than World War I or World War II. Anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, favorite, and share the video if you feel so inclined. Still haven't come up with a new outro, but I'll talk to you again soon. Take care.